Welcome back. Still here with us is Mustafa Talpur from Oxfam Asia. Mustafa, thank you for staying with us. Another element that your report, rather Oxfam's report, touches on is the issue of women facing a lot of challenges during this pandemic. One of the pre-existing problems in Asia before the pandemic hit was the economic and social disadvantages that women were already facing on the continent and continue to face even today, this being the result of several factors. But especially, according to the report, patriarchal systems and neoliberal policies, if I'm saying it correctly. Can you give us more details about how and in what ways women were disproportionately affected during this time? And maybe you could give us a few case studies of countries where this was especially prevalent.
Yeah, so I think even before the pandemic, there were two major issues with the women's work in Asia and Pacific. One, of course, is the majority of women, actually majority of workers, two-thirds in Asia Pacific are in the informal work. And then majority of those two-thirds are the women. So when the pandemic hit, actually the most affected workforce was the informal workers, the people who were working in the houses, in the service industry, in the tourism, they were sent back to the home. So the majority of the women lost the jobs and the income.
Right.
But losing the income was the one part. But another part, when they were at the home, the already disproportional burden of the care work and the care services are on the shoulders of the women. And this we have been talking since long.
Right.
That the current economic model is actually not valuing women's work that they do at the home. But this is the essential care services that run our economies and societies.
Could you explain what you mean by care services?
So what we mean by care services is the work that women do at the household, taking care of the elders, taking care of the sick, taking care of the children, fetching water, cleaning, cooking, all that kind of services that are undocumented, that are not part of the economic measures that when we measure the gross domestic products and the GNPs and whatever.
Right.
So this is actually the billionaire wealth is built on the shoulders of the women's unpaid care work. Just give you a few examples.
Sure.
So currently, women comprise more than 70% of the health workers and 80% of the nurses in Asia Pacific. But when the pandemic hit, 60% of women faced barrier to seeing a doctor due to the pandemic in South Asia, and the health services disruption actually caused them 11,000 additional maternal deaths, as I mentioned. In 2021, one of the UN agency reports that 30% of women in ASEAN countries have experienced an increase in domestic work since the start of pandemic, as I said, because they were on the home, the men were also home, but because men and women don't share the equal care work in the responsibilities, that's on the woman's shoulders. So they were doing more work, 30% more work at the household. And their ILO estimates that the labor force participation rate has also been decreased by 1.3 percentage points. So they were hit by the employment, by the income, and by the increasing in the care work. So that is actually further creating the disadvantages for the women and achieving the gender inequality in the Asia Pacific.
Another risk that was facing women is obviously, aside from these the dangers of unpaid work and care work, as you'd mentioned, was an increase in violence that we also saw against women during the pandemic here in Asia. What were some of the contributing factors to that? Because we did see a spike, an unexpected spike. So what were the driving forces behind that?
Yeah, I think because the pandemic's effect, long lockdowns. So when the people don't have to go out and the work, but also the reduced income because women were bringing the money at the household level, so meeting the necessary expenditures. So when the men lost job, when the women lost job, and they're all sitting in the home, you don't have enough money. So then these actually cause the increase in the domestic violence. And as I said, because the care burden is on the woman, so that actually increased the violence because there was no much income coming into the houses.
Right.
And the men were also sitting at the house, not having the. So these are kind of also psychological challenges that many countries faced.
Right.
People not having work to go out.
Another element that the report touches on is that women, a lot of women, in fact, face barriers trying to seek access to medical care as well. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think that I already talked that the majority of the healthcare workers and the nurses are women,
Right.
but they faced barrier to seek the doctor, mainly because of the lockdowns
Right.
and not allowing many people to go to the hospitals. And usually we have seen mostly in the South Asia, the culture that women are accompanied by a man.
Right.
So you can't go too many people to the hospitals due to the lockdown restrictions and all these the protection measures that put in the place. So these were the barriers that women faced, but also because the income loss, as I said,
Yeah.
you don't have money. So there was, and then there was a cost increase into all these services at the time of the pandemic. So you don't have protective equipments to go there. The cost of testing and all that went up. And the other side, you lose the very little income that you had. So all these factors actually contributed to the women facing barriers to seek the doctors.
This does tie into what we talked about before the break about social protection being offered by the government. Oxfam also said that there were some flawed targeting systems when it came to government intervention and social protection, that many people were excluded from emergency assistance. Why was that the case? And what did that look like in many of these countries?
I think it also has a history because the social protection mechanisms in many of the Asian countries are not mature. There are not proper systems.
Okay.
The countries have introduced the systems, but even before the pandemic, just giving you an example, that 61% people had no access of social protection in the Asia and Pacific. And just 24.7% of women and 32% of men were covered by comprehensive social security system. So that's very less coverage. And as countries were learning and establishing the systems, the pandemic hit. And most of the social protection coverage are the formal workers.
Right.
So as I said, so majority of women work in the informal sector. Many of the agricultural laborers are the informal workers. So they were not part of the social protection systems. So when suddenly governments put in some money to protect the people from the pandemic effect, they don't have the listing of the people. They can't identify so soon during putting also the protective measures.
Right.
So because on that emergency, many people were missed out of that. But nevertheless, I think it's a good step that governments put in, but that shouldn't be a temporary measure, because this is a very important element to support people to get out of poverty and support them so they can address the inequality, the challenge that Asia faces.
You talked about how a lot of people were out of jobs as well. Obviously, we saw an acute increase in unemployment. Millions of people here in Asia lost their job. But could you give us an example of just how bad did it get? How acute was that rate of unemployment? And was there an industry or a sector in particular that was hit the hardest?
Yeah, I mean, we have some estimates from International Labour Organization
Right.
that in 2020, about 147 million Asians lost their full-time job just in the first year of the pandemic. And they estimate that by end of 2021, Asia Pacific still will have 57 million fewer jobs than before the pandemic at the end of 2019.
Right.
So it's a 150 million people actually that they lost the job. And as I already said, most of the sector of the people were hit were the informal workers. And in the very first year, in the first quarter actually in 2020, they saw their around 22% fall in the income in the first crisis.
Right.
And the other group of people that were affected were the migrant workers. And by October 2020, the ILO estimated that 230,000 migrant workers actually returned to Philippines,
Right.
and around 120,000 people have returned to Cambodia and Thailand. So this is the sectors that hit hard, and mostly the tourism were hit hard in the countries who relied on the tourism. So, for example, in 60% of workers in Thailand and travel agencies and tour operators registered 0 working hours in the second quarter of 2020.
Right.
So they actually, all the jobs in the tourism sector were wiped out.
One of the more widely discussed findings from the report is, and this is something you prefaced at the start of our discussion as well, is the region saw 20 new so-called pandemic billionaires emerge. And not only that, but as of 2021, November 2021, quote, the richest 1% owned more wealth than the poorest 90% in Asia Pacific, which is something again that you'd mentioned as well. How did these billionaires benefit from the pandemic? What exactly helped contribute to their rise to where they are right now?
Actually, it's the same system that is helping it, whether it's pandemic or not the pandemic. It's the policies that are helping them. Just give you one example.
Sure.
The American the cloth retailing coal company, they canceled the contract with Bangladesh and Korea.
Right.
Just start of the pandemic. It was about $150 million orders. But on just a week later that, the coal paid $109 million dividends to their shareholders.
Right.
So this is how the system actually is helping the rich people and the companies to leave the poor people at the difficult times and make the money. The other thing that helps them is not paying the tax. Actually, there are a lot of loopholes in the global tax system, in the country's tax system, on which these billionaires have been using those since long time. And then thirdly, of course, they don't pay the proper wages. So majority of people now in the job in Asia Pacific, but they are working on the poverty wages.
Right.
So at the first instance, the system is creating inequalities. Later then you tax them, but because the redistribution mechanism at the workplace is not proper, people are not getting the living wages. They don't have proper contracts. So these are the processes that are actually helping the rich people to become richer. But during the pandemic, actually the 20 new billionaires who became billionaires of selling the equipments and the medicines that were used to protect people actually from the pandemic. So it's equipment, the pharmaceutical services needed to fight against the COVID.
Obviously, there's so many more findings from the report that we could get into, but I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, Mustafa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, that's it from us here on All About Money. Have a good evening. We'll see you next week.